Welcome to the Middlesex Moments radio show. I'm Dr. Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College, located right here in Middletown, Connecticut. And today we've got another episode of Meet the Professor. And our willing subject today is Judith Felton, who's been on this show before. But today we're going to talk about, how you ended up coming to Middlesex and what it's like to be a professor here. And I think also I'd be interested to hear how your life experiences led to your involvement with the civic engagement movement that you've been spearheading. So why don't we start with, how did you get here? and also, what do you teach? I forgot to say that.
That's right. So I am the coordinator of the Human Services program here at Middlesex, which is one of our many programs that's thriving and doing very well. And because of that, I teach courses such as counseling and psychology and introduction to human services, and I also oversee our student interns, of which we have around 30 every semester. So that alone will let the audience know that our program is one that has a lot of students very involved in the community, because every semester there's 30 students that we release onto the community, and by the time they graduate they have completed 300 hours of internship experience. So we're very proud of that, and we're very grateful to the community for offering so much up for our students. I got here as a full-timer. I often think that it's somewhat by accident, that I did not grow up on the East Coast. I grew up in Southern California and came to the East based on young 20-something's whim of following someone here. And so went to school in the East and got my graduate degree in social work from Boston University, and from there was asked to teach as an adjunct at Mount Wachusett Community College in Gardner, Massachusetts. And I never really saw myself as a professor. I saw myself as a direct service social worker and also as a community organizer. But I started teaching there, and
were you teaching as an adjunct? As
an adjunct at Mount Wachusett. I taught, what was the course? It was something called Psychology of Self. It was, in the early 80s, and a very touchy-feely course, and it was fun, a lot of fun. And then I moved to Connecticut, and when I first moved to Connecticut I had 2 children, and then became pregnant with a third, and was at one time working 3 part-time jobs here. One as a program planner for what was at the time was the Community Action Agency in Middletown, now called the Community Renewal Team. I was a program planner, and I did their needs assessment, and I was also doing medical social work for a VNA on the side, and then I was teaching adjunct here. I was asked to teach adjunct here. So my first courses here were psychology courses primarily, and then the full-time position for human services came up, and the good news was it required that an MSW be hired, so that was good news for me. And I was a known entity, and applied for the job and got it as a full-time professor. I remember when John Coggins called me, I said, I feel like I'm in the Wizard of Oz. I never believed, like some house had dropped on me and I was in the magic land. I never really thought I would get it. But anyway, that was in 1993, so a long time ago, and I had taught about 2 years part-time here before I got the full-time position.
So you started about 25 years ago. I want to ask about how the students may or may not have changed since then, but we have to pause for just a brief moment and hear a message, and we'll be right back after that message. Well, we're back, and this is Middlesex Moments radio show, and today on the Meet the Professors series, we're featuring Judith Felton, who is a professor of human services, and right before the break, I was trying to do the math quickly, trying to figure out if it's 25 years that you've been here?
At least, yeah. Actually,
like
with part-time, it's more than that.
Yeah. So would you say the students have changed, the ones that you have in your classes, or are they the same?
It's a good question, and I reflect on it a lot. There are days when I say they have changed, that perhaps I sometimes feel they might not be as committed as they once were, but I also have to be aware that I'm older. And what I teach and what I do, I've been doing for a very long time. So have my standards gotten higher? Have I Do I have a sense of impatience that I didn't have before? You know, those are things that I really think about when I'm wondering if students have changed. Certainly, from a technological point of view, they've changed. They know a lot more about technology than I do. They want to communicate via technology, which is a good thing. And I also think in some ways that's impacted, for my field of human services, that's impacted their skill at social engagement.
And so, impacted in a positive way? Or?
No. I would say in a more negative way. So something as simple as in a counseling class, I emphasize all the time that to be a good counselor, you have to make eye contact. You know, that's a very basic thing of active listening. I've had students, and this semester in particular, where students have said, I hate eye contact. They're not used to it. They communicate so much over social media and texting, and they don't make phone calls to call each other up for a date anymore. They break up over texting, you know, so that they really, that notion of the importance of face-to-face eye contact is uncomfortable for them. Can they learn it? Of course, but it's uncomfortable. And so those kinds of things that in the field that I'm in, all those I used to feel might come naturally for my students because they're in a program because they want to help people, but that notion of what it means to be socially engaged, I think, has changed. I feel that they're not as aware of what's going on outside of their lives. They're not readers of the news as much. They're not paying attention to what's going on the political scene in general. Now, of course, there's a handful that are. So one of my passions here on campus is to really have a very active civic engagement life for our students, for our faculty, for our staff, to have the college be known as a place that is on the forefront of civic engagement initiatives. How do we get students involved? How do we get them to even understand that being a civically minded individual is a value, is something, especially as human services workers, that they have to, it's not just about helping someone work out psychological issues. They have to know how programs are funded, how we get at the values of legislators, how we advocate, how we lobby, and what is a value. What is that value is what we add worth to, and so our legislators vote based on what they add worth to. And getting students, I'm getting a little passionate here, I'm sorry, but getting students to understand that seems more difficult today than it might have been when I started.
Do you wonder why they are drawn to human services?
Many of my students are drawn to human services because they've been helped themselves. Some of them have been part of very intricate systems. I have students who have been in many different foster care homes. I have students who live in residential communities now that work with people with psychological or cognitive disabilities, and so they want to give back. That's a major thrust. I just want to give back. And I think sometimes they come to the program not realizing that it's a really rigorous academic program. And so they have to come to the table a little bit and be aware of that.
If you had students 25 years ago that you kind of stayed in touch with, because Middletown is a small community, what's the arc of their career? What happens to them over 20 years?
Well, it varies. I've had just recently I heard from a student who graduated with her associates here and went on to get her bachelor's degree at the University of New Haven and then her master's degree in social work, and now is working. She was able here to do an internship with Veterans Affairs and then was able to do another internship there, and now is a full MSW professional working with vets, which was her dream all along. And she represents a component of our graduates who go on and pursue their social work degrees, masters in social work primarily. Some students have stayed with human services and have become community organizers in different places. I'm thinking of a student who's in Springfield now, but who got her bachelor's and master's in human services and is a community organizer. Others have sort of stopped at the associates level and may have gone on to work at places like the Connection Incorporated that hire associate level people, but then they've been able to work their way up in the Connection, but not necessarily getting higher degrees. Others have gotten their degrees. I have one student who's a personal trainer. She's using her skills that way. I have seen other students over time who never went any further, and I might see them working in a grocery store. So it varies. But I believe most of my students have gone on to higher degrees.
Mm-hmm. So at the same time that those students have had their careers either level out or build, the whole field of human services has got to have changed quite a bit too, right?
Well, it has changed, and I would say that it's changed in this way, that what job students used to be able to get with associate levels or bachelor's degree, they now need a master's for. So the credentialing process has changed some, and I have very mixed feelings about that, because you'll see master's level people doing the kind of work, not always, and if anybody's listening here, I don't, but not always, but you might see a master's level person helping a client reintegrate into the community via opening checking accounts, finding housing, being able to learn how to maneuver the aisle of a grocery store. My feeling is you don't need a master's level person to do that. And in fact, I talked to a legislator last year, I can't remember who now, but who I was sort of saying the system could save money if you went back to letting associate level people do those kinds of jobs that don't pay necessarily as well, but the system would save money. However, you also have master's level people doing the work that an associate's level couldn't do, such as really high level interviewing and counseling and interventions. But I think it's changed more, as I think this is true of many disciplines, where the level of education you need to do has changed so that it's a higher level of education, whereas lower levels of education used to be able to do that work.
I think that's a trend, right, in a lot of fields.
Yeah.
But I was also thinking about the complexity of our kind of broken society, the children whose families are dysfunctional, the healthcare delivery system that's inaccessible for a lot of people, the social pressures on adolescence, and the criminalization of our society. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but
I'm not sure that's changed. It feels like it's changed because we have access to so many stories now.
Right, we do.
And so it feels, there are days when I'll go home and think, oh my God, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. But then there were real problems in the 50s, and there were real problems in the 60s, and there's always been people in need. There have always been people who struggle with addiction. The good news is that we have more programs now, and so from my perspective as a professor, that means there's more opportunities for students. We have a lot more programs that work with people with addiction. We have now community-based programs that deal with people with mental illness, whereas in the 70s, if you wanted to work with adults with mental illness, your only opportunity was CVH. Now there's all kinds of residential programs that enable students to get opportunities. We have things like recovery coaches, where a student can be kind of a support or a recovery coach to someone who's an addict. That's a new kind of intervention. And so the need is still there. The good news is that we have more creativity in terms of how we respond to that need, and then that domino effect comes down to having more opportunities for our students.
What do you think, so as you're going through that, I'm thinking, what do you think about the stigma attached to mental illness? Has that changed?
I don't think it has changed. And we can talk in a few minutes about why I think it's still an incredible problem.
It is, it's a problem even in terms of insurance coverage and everything else associated with it. So why don't we pause for a break, and when we come back, let's talk about that issue. So we'll be right. Well, we're back, and it's Middlesex Moments radio show, and Judith Felton and I are talking about her field, really, and did the students change over the last 25 years, and have the human services organizations changed? And now we've come onto the really big issue, which is, has the stigma changed? So what do you think about that?
I think there is more awareness about people who struggle with mental illness. I think that we have great community programs, and we also have educational institutions like ours that really work hard to destigmatize those who struggle with mental illness, to do away with the myths and stereotypes about people who live with mental illness. So I think that there's an awful lot of good public awareness going on. And in some cases, that public awareness is initiated by those who live with the illness themselves, so that there's the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, and a lot of those individuals are advocates, and they make their story known. And in fact, as part of our Courageous Conversation series, we're having a client come in who struggles with mental illness to share his or her story. I'm not sure if it's male or female yet. And that anytime a story is told, that helps to decrease stigma. However, I still think that the first thing that people think about when they think of someone who struggles with mental illness is the label. So someone hears that, their neighbor has schizophrenia, all they're going to think about is crazy, hallucinations, danger, all those things we assume. And they're not going to see that person as an individual, they're going to see that person as a label, and in part, labels are there in part, not completely, but in part to give the insurance companies the information they need to reimburse for treatment. Diagnostic labels really help. It helps an individual understand their story, and it helps people who do interventions know what the best treatment is. The downside of it is that a label becomes an identity. So we don't have that same level of stigma for someone who struggles with cancer. We don't say, oh, there's Joe, he's cancerous. We'd never say that. But we might say, there's Joe, he's a schizophrenic. And it's really damaging. And it's damaging to our ability to embrace human nature. And it's damaging to the individual who struggles. And when you have media stories, whenever there's some kind of shooting, and it says, person mentally ill, person mentally unstable, that wreaks havoc with the self-esteem of every person who struggles with a mental illness. Just like if all you ever heard was a woman with gray hair yet again shoots up a movie theater, that every person with gray hair, their self-esteem goes down. So the media doesn't help. The media doesn't help with lessening the stigma of people with disability. And it's not just mental illness, it's addiction, it's physical challenges, it's whatever's different. Has it changed? I think the attempts to address stigma has gotten better. Do people come into the world having much more open-mindedness about it? Unless they make themselves learn, I don't think they do. So.
And to some degree, I think this goes into this question of media, especially if you're getting your information kind of unvetted through social media or whatever the students and our community members are reading. It's often superficial, misguiding, incomplete, inaccurate. There's and those are highly problematic.
One of the things I keep reminding myself as a professor, and especially, I've been here the longest of many of your faculty now, which is hard to believe because I still feel like I just started yesterday. But and there's a unique role in being a veteran, which I'm still trying to figure out what that means. What does it mean to be a faculty member who's been here for a long time? What role should I play? But one of the things I keep reminding myself when I'm in front of the classroom is that the information I might share with my students, they are hearing for the first time. I sometimes make assumptions that students come in and of course they know that persons who struggle with a mental illness aren't dangerous. Of course they know that. Of course they know that all social problems have many, many causes. And I have to remind myself, and this is the beauty of being where I am at a community college, is that for the most part students are learning new things. I'm in front of the classroom and with my students just like all my faculty colleagues are, and it's so exciting to think how they might change over the course of the 2 years or 4, and in some cases 10 years they're with us. They are going to change, and that we get to be part of that change. And again, that's why I am such a proponent of civic engagement, because the learning takes place outside of the classroom, actually much more than I think it takes place inside of the classroom. So if my students go out and they're working side by side, someone who's struggling with a disability, they're going to learn so much more from that person's story than they're ever going to hear from me, unless they want to hear about what it means to be aging, but but other than that, that's why it's so important to get students outside of the classroom and into the community, because that's where all their learning takes place.
Yeah, I completely agree. But I wanted, because this program is going to drive to an abrupt halt shortly. This half hour goes by way too quickly. When you think back to your undergraduate and graduate education, were there faculty members who changed you?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I had a faculty member in my undergraduate years. I majored in English, and I just, she changed me in that she read my papers very carefully, and she gave me opportunities. She kept asking me to teach the classes for her, not in a way that she wanted to check out, but, I guess she felt I had a particular expertise or whatever. I don't know, maybe she did that to everybody, but it sure made me realize that I could be passionate about something, and that I also had a story to tell. So she was a life changer. I had two professors in graduate school, one who taught counseling and case management, and she just had and I actually try to model my style after her. She just had a very intimate way of engaging with her students and seemed to make every one of us feel like we were the only person that mattered to her. But she also was not afraid to critique us, and the thing that I remember the most is that we were doing a case study of somebody, and I was sitting there as a student thinking I knew everything, and she's asking us how we would respond to this particular client in the case study. And I turned to her and I said, well, shouldn't we ask blah, blah, blah? And she looked right at me and she said, no. And I'll never forget that. And then she explained, but it also in my teaching has given me permission to not be afraid to say what's right and what's wrong in any kind of skill I'm trying to present, and to remember that I do know something.
Right.
And as long as you explain why you say no or yes. And then the third was my professor of community organization, I believe it was, and I did my research for him on immigration. And I worked very, very hard on it, and I did my presentation, and afterwards he really praised me for what I had done, but he also said at the same time, he said, I see you as a mediator. I see you as a social worker who will be a mediator between diverse parties. And I'll just never forget that. Mm-hmm. And I think in some ways I do practice that in my day-to-day life at the college in some ways. So certainly with students.
Absolutely. You're mediating reality to some degree, right? And multiple realities.
And trying to help people make connections, and that both in my role as the coordinator for civic engagement, but also in my role as a professor. So
I wonder if people, going back to this idea of first principles and basic fundamental concepts, I'll say I didn't really quite appreciate how broad the reach was of social work. Mm-hmm. I mean, why is it even called social work?
Well, it started in the days of the getting your hands dirty movement with Jane Addams, and really getting in there. And I guess it means the workers of those who engage on a social problems level to make better the lives of individuals.
Right, yeah. And ultimately to build up toward a healthier society.
Yes, exactly,
right?
Exactly.
Right.
So social work, this is something hard for my students to understand sometimes. Human services social work really has its birth in the movement of social change and the reform movements that have changed communities and changed policy, because these days there's so much emphasis on clinical social work, and so students sometimes forget, this person's in trouble because of the big picture. We have to look at what are the deep-rooted reasons why people have addiction, why people hurt their children, because of the deeper-rooted ones are unemployment and poverty, and that's what we have to get at before we can even think about changing the life of an individual.
And those are those things, the poverty and the lack of education and the poor mm-hmm. health and the hunger.
That's exactly right.
Are the perennial topics of every election cycle.
Yes,
so
yes.
I guess we have to just keep trying, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's right. Never give up.
Right.
Never give up.
So one thing we should say before the program ends is that you are organizing courageous conversations, mm-hmm, and they mm-hmm. happen at the college.
They happen the last month during the school year. We have courageous conversations that happen the last Monday of every month at 12 o'clock in our library, 12 to 1. And these are opportunities for us to bring the community, to bring students, staff together to talk about topics of our time in a courageous and safe manner and in an environment that's safe. So things like freedom of speech, things like immigration reform, things like homophobia and transphobia, and things like mental illness and how we respond. And really, we started these because we wanted to figure out a way to go from being sort of passive learners to active learners and moving from passivity to action. So we're hoping that these conversations will engage individuals so that they want to take actions. My dream would be that after a conversation, the next day I would be seeing students marching in the streets. That's my dream. And so that's really part of the purpose.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I greatly appreciate that you're organizing this. So I'm sure we're out of time because the clock keeps ticking. And so I want to thank you. Thank you, Judith Felton. And
can I just say one more thing? Anybody who's interested in listening to this, interested in human services, the human services program, I just want to state that our foundational philosophy is that everybody is capable of change. And we believe that not only for individuals, but for communities and the local, national, global level as well. So that's what we're about.
And so if you want to talk to Judith more about that, you can find her through our website on the World Wide Web, mxcc.edu. And I encourage everybody to take that opportunity or to come for the Courageous Conversations or any number of other things that happen on this campus. Right. So stay tuned. Thanks, Judith, and thanks to the listeners. And I'm wishing everybody a very good day.